Welcome to the Peace Talk, this time with Benjamin Franks. Benjamin Franks is a political scientist, philosopher, and senior lecturer in social and political philosophy at the University of Glasgow. His research interests are Marxism, anarchism, post-anarchism, and applied ethics, especially in the field of anti-political and political action, education, and social research. He published several books and scientific articles. Dear Benjamin, I'm very glad and honored that you found the time for this philosophical talk.
Well, thank you. I'm delighted and honoured to be asked, Joseph. So the pleasure is mine. I hope I have something meaningful to offer your viewer.
I'm sure of that. Let me begin with a more personal question, and then we go deeper into your work and research and books. So what did motivate you to study in the first place? And did you have any academic role models back then? And did they change maybe?
Right. I'll try and do with why did I get interested in anarchism? I'll try and deal with that. That goes back into a little bit of my personal background and the fact that I come from a suburb of Birmingham. And you can, in a sense, the genesis of my interest can be found in the decision of the West Midlands Public Transport Executive to bring in single operator buses where there was only a bus driver, no conductor. And to get on the bus, you had to have the exact change. If you didn't have the exact fare, whatever money you put in over it, you lost because they wouldn't give you any change. And so near the bus stop, from the centre of Birmingham to my house, number 37 back then, there used to be a radical bookshop. And if I didn't have change, I would nip in there and buy whatever was the cheapest fanzine in order to get the change to pay my bus fare. And it was often an anarchist or anarcho-punk fanzine from the late 70s and early 1980s. And I remember one in particular, which cost 5p. And it said, if you paid for this, thank you very much. And if you stole it, congratulations on your initiative. And as a sort of adolescent, I found that hilarious and intriguing and seductive. So I was reading anarchist literature from a relatively early age, thanks to the Birmingham buses and the management of it. When I went to university, and back in the early 1980s, well, it'd be 1986, I went off to university, so mid-1980s. All the major cities still had a radical bookshop. Now, whether it was Grassroots in Manchester, Key Books in Birmingham, News from Nowhere in Liverpool, they were a feature of cities. So I was still frequenting these alternative bookshops, though from an early age, I'd been a member of the Labour Party or youth sections of it from sort of 7 or 8, and indeed was a Labour Party member in my late teens. But I was growing increasingly disenchanted with the Labour Party, especially when the poll tax arose. Now, I don't know how many of your viewers would remember the poll tax, or the community charge, was brought in by Margaret Thatcher, which was a highly regressive tax. Initially, the poorest person paid as much as a billionaire. And this, on top of all the other changes Margaret Thatcher brought in, created mass opposition. Absolutely mass opposition, and some of the groups which the very first anti-poll tax union in Britain was formed by the anarchists, and they became quite significant in the opposition to the poll tax. Well, the Labour Party, its strategy was, they'll wait until we're elected. We may, if we are elected and it's high enough up our electoral strategy, we might get round to abolishing it and putting something pretty similar in its place. So I became highly disenchanted with the Labour Party and became more and more interested and I already knew some people who were anarchists and became closer to them. At the same time, my degree was coming to an end. It was the second Thatcher recession. I couldn't get a job. And again, back then, somewhat of a luxury, you could do a postgrad degree by research and MPhil by research part-time and still claim housing benefit and unemployment benefit. And as I couldn't get a job, I thought I might as well fill in my time by trying to get a higher degree. And I was writing about my favorite dead German Jewish philosopher. I find all the best philosophers are at least 2 out of being dead German and Jewish. So I was writing about Herbert Marcuse. And at the same time, there was another postgrad who was writing about the situationists, a woman called Sadie Platt, wrote this fantastic book called The Most Radical Gesture. And I became increasingly interested that in anarchism, in situationist ideas, in radical non-Leninist forms of Marxism, and in the background of the sort of poll tax rebellion and its aftermath. And I was kind of aware, as I no doubt you are, Joseph, that especially back then, but still today, anarchism is massively misrepresented, both in academia and the wider culture. So when I was taught, and you weren't taught much anarchism at all on a philosophy degree, but where it did rise, it was either presented as a wholly utopian set of ideas that were all essentially good, and that all we need to do is get rid of the state and we'll all magically become good, even though no anarchist actually says that, or that they're all extreme free marketeers, you know, the so-called anarcho-capitalist version, which is still the dominant way in which American institutions, if Netflix is anything to go by, portrays anarchism, or we're just mindless hooligans. And clearly I was or the fourth option, the fourth representation, is that it was a movement from the past. Sort of, it kind of developed to maybe in 1 or 2 places, Spain often, and maybe they might make mention of Ukraine if you're a particularly well-informed lecturer back then. But largely, oh look, there was this tiny current in Spain that suddenly became significant when it disappeared again. And that's all you can say. It's a movement of the past, isn't it? Romantic and beautiful, and of no contemporary relevance. So you'd even get politics textbooks on contemporary British politics today in 1990, which would make no mention of the anarchism, even though there had been a constant current of anarchism from the 1880s to the then present day, and they've been active in all sorts of movements, whether it was peace movements, environmental movements, anti-poll tax movements. So there's this kind of incredible omission. So I thought I could do a PhD on this, and no one's covering, you know, this is back in the early 1990s, no one's covering contemporary anarchism. You know, the only way it's ever represented is a historical movement, or inaccurately as anarcho-capitalism. This is a way in. However, no one is interested. Top tips for scholars here. Not many funding bodies, especially sort of wealthy charities run by your local friendly philanthropic plutocrat, is interested in funding PhDs on anarchism. So it took me many years and some incredible good fortune to finally get scholarship to start it in '96. So during that period, I'd actually started writing it. I did do a year self-funded, but funded through, you know, I was told I'd get tutor work and seminar work at a university in Birmingham. I fell out with the department and my supervisor, who I'm a fantastic person, but we were moving in separate directions. And I realized that I had no future there. They didn't exactly throw me out, they just made it clear they won't give me any paid employment. and therefore I couldn't afford the fees to stay there. So I then tried to write it independently for a few years, then got very fortunate, got a scholarship at Nottingham, and completed it there. And I wouldn't have been able to complete it without the type of supervisory support, access to resource, which the university was able to provide me. So that's how I got interested in anarchism. I wrote about it. The other part of your question was who inspired me. There were two, lots of different inspirations. One set of inspirations were people in universities I didn't like, and I didn't want to end up like them. The guy, the lecturer of the 1980s, this sort of would turn up with his yellowing lecture notes from one year to the next, slowly reading them out in a monotone to the rest of the class. I knew I didn't want to be like that. I wanted to try and do stuff which would intrigue and interest students, but would still be academically rigorous, would still portray the scholastic virtues. So there was a kind of reaction against some standard academics. I think there were fewer of them today. And my supervisor, who was a lovely guy for my MPhil, when he was supervising me for my MPhil, I discovered had been involved in a libertarian socialist movement, quite an influential one, but one which is oddly little known, a group called Solidarity, which had Maurice Brinton as its sort of key figure, and so he was giving me access to his archive of anarchist, libertarian, socialist, heterodox, Marxist texts. And like I say, I was mixing with Sadie. And then my oldest school friend, a guy I went to infant school, junior school, senior school with, he got interested in the situationists as well. He is really, really bright. And he wrote a fantastic book on situationist architecture, art theory and planning called The Situationist City. And he managed to land academic jobs. Now I have no ambition. I've never known what I wanted to do in life. I still don't, but I saw he could get a job and I thought, well, maybe that's possible for me. However, it took me 12 years of precarious contracts and again, an incredible slice of luck to land this current job. And there's always, anyone working in the humanities in Britain is always at risk of redundancy. There is no job security. There's always the apparent or real threat. But there you go. That's some of my inspirations and background to how I ended up here.
I can totally feel you and I understand you, and it's yeah, I make the same observations here in the University of Austria in Vienna. First, the canon is like the philosophical, and in political science and in social science, maybe it's okay. Foucault, you have Marx, you have Gramsci, you have these progressive thinkers and feminist thinkers. But no anarchism. There is no such thing. No seminar concentrating on anarchism. The nearest what you get is maybe Rancière, Jacques Rancière. This is the nearest on anarchism that you will get, but no classical writings such as Bakunin, Kropotkin, Malatesta, Mach, no, Emma Goldman, no. You don't hear it, you don't see it, you cannot write it, and there is not even a hint. But it's okay. I get used to it, and now I'm like a Marxist, but with a hidden anarchistic.
Which is not unusual. I mean, but one of the points, well, once you start engaging with the stuff, you realize that Marx and Bakunin had that famous falling out. But the anarchist groups and the Marxist groups, the actual people who are reading and engaged on the ground, they didn't care about Marx and Bakunin falling out. Indeed, the terms Marxist, anarchist, communist before the Russian Revolution were largely malleable terms. The avowedly Marxist newspapers were selling Kropotkin texts, and Bakunin was hired to translate Marx. That's why they fell out. He didn't deliver. The idea that somehow these are polar opposites. What made them opposites was Leninism, and Leninism is one which kind of constructed. The big schism came in 1871 with Workers' International, which is absolute, inaccuracies. Anarchist groups, Marxist groups from the 1880s right until 1917, 1918 were working with each other, and many didn't even identify as one or the other.
Yeah, that's true. Maybe some students are watching us, so it's worth to mention that there is Emma Goldman Award for scientific writings. And there is this Flux Foundation, which is also a good opportunity. And maybe the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation that sometimes spent money on anarchism and anarchistic studies and research. So yeah, maybe for students on this, it's worth to mention. And in my opinion, it's just taught in Loughborough, the university in England.
Loughborough have a centre, have a terrific nucleus of anarchist scholars, people like Ruth Kinner, Dave Berry, Matthew Adams. They're clustered there. There's an anarchist research group down there. There are other scholars working on anarchism. They may be able to introduce a bit of it into their curricula. Some may. Back in the day, I managed to run a course on Marxisms and anarchisms, but no longer sadly runs for political reasons, institutional political reasons, not state reasons. So they are courses where it comes up. It is oddly a part of the politics A level on most curriculums within sixth form in schools, though I am, although people like Uri, Gordon and Ruth Kinner, I think, have helped produce materials for that part of the A level, I don't know to what degree their suggestions are followed, or even indeed whether it is a core or just a supplementary part of the curriculum. So there is bits of anarchism within British institutions, but it's minor. I know I have mixed feelings about this. First, because I'm worried that the anarchist academic voice becomes the dominant voice, and that should not be happening. Anarchism is a working class movement, and it should be a predominantly working class movement, and it should be the grassroots voice which is the most vocal. It's not, but similarly, 50% more or less of young people go to universities in Britain. You don't want them to be mistaught what anarchism is. Many of them will be going on to skilled working class jobs, whether it's in teaching or nursing or just some forms of administration. And so I feel there is a role for anarchist-informed academics to play.
As you mentioned, the misrepresentation, it's my hobby to collect some speeches, texts, and also if I see it on I don't know, on the street or wherever, I took a photo, I took a picture, and I collect this data of misrepresentation of anarchism, because I'm always angry if it's used synonymously to chaos and violence and this stuff. And so in my anger, this is the only thing that I can do, is to collect it, and maybe someday it will be published, and yeah.
But it's interesting to view it from the ideological perspective of liberals and conservatives. And there's a reason why. It's not they're being wholly dishonest in portraying anarchism as chaotic. If you believe that hierarchy is necessary, that the only types of organization are ones based on hierarchies of established authority or of wealth, then people who can say that you can organize differently are by definition chaotic. Similarly, if you feel that that it is legitimate to contest property rights where they are being oppressive, that a broken window of a armament dealer is less violent, less oppressive than to allow an armaments dealer to go and challenge, then that's clearly the anarchist position. But if you see that as a violation of property rights, an unjustifiable violation of property rights, then of course you're violent and chaotic and a hooligan. So from their ideological perspective, they're not being dishonest. It is perfectly consistent with their worldview. And that's why it's important to recognize where there are intersections with other ideologies and to engage with those people from other perspectives so that you can explain, well, this is how you constructed this rule.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah. Before we get into the philosophical debate or discussion or talk about the differences between anarchism and post-anarchism, maybe we should begin with a small history. You wrote a very intriguing book, Rebel Alliances, the Means and Ends in Contemporary British Anarchism, published in AK Press 2006, if I remember correctly. And there you describe many groups, many grassroots movements, many, and it was kind of intriguing to see that there is social democratic movements, Green Party movements, and workers' unions, and anti-globalization, anti-third world debt campaigners, even from the Christian churches, and so on and so forth. And so my question is, what do they have in common? And what is the link between them and anarchism? And let us begin with a small history of British social movements. And I know it could take you 3 hours to talk about this, but maybe we start from here.
Okay, one of my start points, because although I finished the initial PhD in 2000, the book itself, by the time I turned it into something which is for a readership which isn't your doctoral examiners, is a different type of text. It was, by the time it came out, it's 2006. And I was aware that one of my bones of contention was that anarchism, one of the ways in which anarchism was being tamed, and indeed, I think a slightly lazy response by some of the anarchists themselves, was to view the anti-globalization movement as perhaps even a synonym of anarchism or the main focus of anarchism, anarchist activities. And indeed, when I initially tried to get the PhD published, because it was the high point of the anti-globalization or alter-globalization movement, one of the publishers I sent it to said they'd be interested, but they didn't want the focus on anarchist groups, they wanted the focus on alter-globalization. And I say, well, no, that's just a brief moment. Now, anarchism in Britain, is over 120 years old at this point. So we fell out, and thankfully AK Press were much more sympathetic, an excellent press to work with, and they're much more sympathetic. So the history of British anarchism, even the start point is contested. So the start point is clearly, though, in migrant communities, and one of the most significant migrants to have an influence on the development of British anarchism is Johann Most, who was, of course, exiled in Britain and was having to get his publications printed in Britain and then smuggled into Germany. So it's largely for a German audience rather than a British audience. The other, there were developing sort of more settled anarchist movements. You also got the big influx of immigrants from Eastern Europe, largely Jewish immigrants, and possibly, arguably, perhaps the first anarchist newspaper might be the Arbeiter Front, the Workers' Friend, which was a Yiddish anarchist newspaper, which grew out of the Polish Yiddish, which was an earlier socialist anarchist newspaper. But around the same time, you get Kropotkin himself, a Russian immigrant, creating Freedom Press. You get Malatesta, who's settled from Italy. So it's very much, it's always been a movement of multiplicities, of multiple identities, of migrants, workers, people aware of other forms of exploitation and domination, as well as economic domination and exploitation. And of course, the role of women should not be underplayed in this. Rudolf Rocker's wife was very significant in supporting Rocker's support of the Jewish workers. You get lots of women involved. Wilson's involved in Freedom Press. You get Emma Goldman coming over from America to support British endeavors. You even get Kropotkin's wife when he's imprisoned, doing lecture tours to try and get to raise the plight of her husband. So it's always been aware of the multiplicities of forms of domination and how they intersect, how they don't get reduced to one form, but how they mutually intersect. So you get the early anarchist movements in largely working class communities, increasingly with a trade union bent or trades union bent, a syndicalist bent. So you get trade unions, some of which were originally admitted migrants because they saw them as bringing down the wages of British workers, or supportive of certain anti-Semitic tropes. Jews were somehow incompatible with socialism, and of course you then get the Jewish migrant groups, organizing, and they mutually break down the barriers and offer mutual support.
So this is the anarcho-syndicalist movement that even exists now today.
That's right. So you get the origins of that. You get obviously groups coming over and influence, a big influence in early 20th century Britain. You get the IWW, the revolutionary syndicalists. They have a large section of anarchists in there, embody an awful lot of anarchist principles. So there are some differences with anarcho-syndicalism. Nevertheless, they are certainly open to engagement with anarchism. And so you get groups in Glasgow with thousands and thousands of members prior to the First World War. You've got John Maclean offering education classes through the IWW up in Clydeside. And then you get the double tragedy, as it were, of the First World War, which meant people like Rudolf Rocker were interned. The great rise of patriotic feeling, which undermined the internationalism of revolutionary socialisms. And then you also get the Russian Revolution. And that seemed to be a vindication of Lenin's reading of Marxism and Lenin's form of organization. So you get Marxism then becoming synonymous with Leninism. Leninism is Marxism, Marxism is Leninism. All the alternatives are either subsumed. You join the Communist Party, we've got the Moscow Gold, you could join with us and become powerful. Look, we've got the right strategy. Or you're objectively, according to Leninism, counter-revolutionary. And so the heterodox Marxist traditions, the non-Leninist traditions, though they survive, and the anarchist traditions, though they still survive, lose most of their perspective. And they lose all their influence. And of course, then the dominant narrative for the short 20th century, from 1917 to 1990, is liberalism versus Marxism, and by Marxism they mean Leninism. And there is very little room for anything else. Hence why anarchism was marginalized, why you don't get big discussions of council communism within the lecture rooms, why a whole set of Marxist traditions were completely lost alongside Leninism and other radical socialist traditions like guild socialism.
Yeah. And there is also the second, in your book, you described this historical periods of anarchism, and the second one was the Spanish Civil War and the Hungarian Revolution. So we are talking about the period of 1936, the Spanish Revolution, and then we go on to 1956. So yeah.
That's right. So you get, where there are schisms, where the breakdown in the narrative of Leninism versus liberalism starts to break down, you get these arrivals of new forms of revolutionary politics. So you get in 36 you've got Spain and the communists basically sabotaging the revolution in order to maintain their own hegemony. So they sacrifice the Spanish proletariat to its own geopolitical consequences, its own instrumentalism. And this obviously provokes certain reactions, especially when you get the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact. Well, we were the opposition to Nazism. Oh, hang on a moment, we can cooperate. The real enemy is, so you get these breakaway groups. You then get, obviously, the big one, 56 in Hungary, and then later 68 in Czechoslovakia, which create a new left. Now, part of the narrative of Leninism versus liberalism was that Marxism is not imperialist. It's for capitalists who are imperialists. And yet you've got tanks rolling into Hungary to put down a socialist revolution. You get the tanks rolling into Prague to put down workers' revolts. And so the narrative of Leninism faces these moments of crises, and you get the development of alternative lefts, where they're rediscovering previous Marxisms, previous forms of socialism, including anarchism. To get this big revival, where get the new left revivals from 56, hastened by 68.
We have a similar moment. Maybe it's a parallel. Maybe I'm wrong, but I see a parallel in this occupation of Hungary and Prague, the invasion of Prague, and the Russian invasion now in Ukraine. Maybe it's a similarity. It's an uprising, and now the narrative is, oh, we help our Russian people, but the contrary is happening, and yeah, maybe it's.
The whole. Now, there is a kind of meta-narrative which was constructed after the fall of the Soviet Union. Of course, people like Fukuyama, which when I was first entering into some positions within academia, there was the democratization thesis, that with the fall of the Soviet Empire, markets would be dominant, and with it would be democratic institutions. And you get the rise of representative democracy, market economy. Yeah, there may be some marginal differences around to what degree they could be social democratic and what degree they would be Thatcherite. But the main ideological arguments were over. There was the sort of golden arches thesis that, and I can remember this being, discussed seriously. And if you wanted big grants, which, I've never been getting, you supported these myths because they're the ones which the dominant funding bodies wanted, but where capitalism had entrenched itself through things like McDonald's, this bring peace and prosperity, because where there was a middle class big enough to support McDonald's and a global infrastructure of markets sufficient to maintain the McDonald's supply chain, there would be too much to lose by going to war. and the democratization thesis that we were moving more and more towards democracy. And this was the dominant narrative from the late 1990s to about 2008, even though it was starting to crack in 2006, 2007, 2008. Actually, sort of reversals in democracy in places like China quite early on. But nevertheless, these narratives were still dominant, and again, they're narratives which clearly exclude anarchism. If liberalism is the only game in town, then what can anarchism offer? You're just being utopian, you're being ridiculous. Look, we've got, a latest update of our mobile phone. We've got, the great entrepreneurial heroes coming onto our screens and telling us how to run our societies better. And then you got the banking crisis. And from then on, we no longer live in neoliberalism. Neoliberalism came to an end with a full stop in 2008. There were precursors to that, obviously, in the Argentinian credit crises and some of the rebellions in South America and Central America. But when it hits the West, that's when people really take notice. The banking crisis of 2000, 2007, 2008, where the bankers, the great heroes of our narrative, the heroes who've been invited in to run our institutions, were shown to be as corrupt, self-interested, short-sighted, ignorant as even the most standard bureaucrat and manager.
I totally agree. Yeah, it's absolutely right analysis. Yes, and then you mentioned in your book a third period where the new left is so to speak evolved after 56 till 76, and after that we have this in the 70s, 80s, this punk and do-it-yourself cultures. So we have another type of evolving of subcultures, so to speak.
Absolutely, and these, of course, these are heuristics. They're simple devices to cover certain groups and highlight certain features I want to discuss. They are permeable. You still got groups operating who existed for 30, 40 years prior to the 1980s. We've got Freedom Press, for instance, who still continue to this day. But yeah, you get the rise of do-it-yourself. You get, which is itself part of the countercultural movement. But you get the punk, the much more agitational, with streams of it which are much more overtly class conscious and anti-capitalist.
Yeah. Before I ask you how strong or widespread the anarchist movement is nowadays in Britain, I want to ask you, you made a point in and you termed it like where it is, class struggle anarchism. So what do you mean by class struggle anarchism? Are there different kind of anarchisms? Are there what is
question? Sorry, Joseph, interrupted.
No, yeah. What is the key difference between other types of anarchism, or why this term class struggle anarchism?
Like, because at the time I was writing, there was still, as it were, sections of academia which were still covering free market, absolute free marketeers, proprietarians as anarchists. I wanted to make sure when I was talking about anarchism, I was not talking about them. And there were forms even within the anarchist subcurrent in the 70s and 80s who seemed to be much more amenable to market solutions, even though they were still had a foothold within anarchism, as it were, sort of more liberal anarchisms, who, people like Richard Hunter actually went off to become a fascist, but he wasn't a fascist at that moment, sort of thinking that the Thatcherite narrative of the minimal state would provide opportunities for anarchism to flourish, but replacing the hierarchical nation state with the hierarchies of global capitalism, which the nation state is set up to support as viciously as possible, I think is a complete misunderstanding of what anarchism was about. And it probably wasn't a surprise that his later orientations took him somewhere else. But nevertheless, you got within certain anarchist subcurrents, cultural currents, the idea it's just about individual liberation. But as long as I live my life as freely as possible, I don't have to worry about anyone else. And that, I think, is a misunderstanding of the way in which identity operates, in which social practices operate, and therefore is a misunderstanding of anarchism. But they were there, and I can't ignore them. And they were part of the broader anarchist subcurrent. And sometimes it was subconscious. They were repeating this in their text, but actually their modes of operation were not doing that. But they were building links of solidarity, but they recognized you couldn't be free while other people were in chains. So you get some people go, be part of a sort of free market counterculture, while simultaneously, kicking against capitalism.
Yeah, I totally understand you, and it was funny to read the introduction, the preface of Robert Paul Wolff's book In Defense of Anarchism from 1998, and he wrote that not many people reviewed or criticized or whatever his book. And there were some fans. He wrote, after the book appeared, I received a number of warm, appreciative letters from right-wing libertarians, a fact that gave me greater pause, I must confess, than all of the highly technical counter-arguments in the philosophical journals. So yeah, we have this movements. Yeah, this started, I believe, from Murray Rothbard to Friedman, and this free market ideology. To some degree, I sympathize with them when they are criticizing the state, but in other aspects, especially in the philosophical sense, especially when it comes to the subject, to the individual, what is a subject? I don't agree with their premises. Their premises are, their theoretical premises are that the subject, and you wrote it also, this is also your critique, that the subject is an ahistoric, freebooting, self-seeking, egoistic nomad. So yeah, this can't be, you can't be serious putting that premise in a theory. So
I know. I'm as you know, I'm a little bit of a McIntyrean. I like Alistair McIntyre, and he sums it up beautifully. We are dependent rational animals. We are all of those. We are not freebooting. I needed someone to raise me in order to be where I am, and even now I need mutual support. My family, my friends, my colleagues, to even have any sense of self-worth in order to operate. And so we are not the characters which free market liberals posit on us and try to shape us to be. This is not just a misdescription, this is a normative program as well.
Absolutely.
So the more they try to break our social ties through contractual obligation, the weaker other types of deeper social relations become undermined. Friendships can't flourish if they're based on contractual obligation.
Yes, on a demonstration with the anarchist autonomous workers union in Vienna, I met a very old guy who received a big pension, and he criticized me why I, as a young man, go on demonstrations, and what is it all about? So you are promoting laziness because we are fighting to shorten the hours, the working hours per week. and he criticized me, and we got in a heated debate. And finally, because he was very proud that he worked for 60, 70 hours per week, and I make money, and I worked my ass off, and he came from this liberal kind of, you have to work, and then there you create your wealth and so forth. And I asked him, but did you found any time for your loved ones, for your family, for your friends? This is also working time. This is also time of your life. And what about that? And then he go away. So he couldn't find an answer. Maybe he was ashamed of himself. I don't know. I don't know this guy, but it was a very nice experience, because yeah, they don't even consider this as important. And yeah.
And so, as you rightly say, so my class struggle anarchists were those who recognised that you can't live in a way that the so-called, and this, you know, I'm going to use the term, but I'm going to put in quotation marks, libertarians put it, because the original libertarians were social anarchists, class struggle anarchists, and it was one of the great ideological successes of Murray Rothbard to deliberately, and he's overt about it, I am going to be out to co-opt this term, and he did it, and they're successful at it. Now, if you go to America and talk about libertarians, you're talking about free market. That is a deliberate co-option and a way of occluding a set of histories and theories and practices for a wider public.
Yeah. And it's also a kind of utopian vision that they have, that they theoretically put in their books, because in my opinion, there are no such things as free markets. Where is the market free? We have restrictions, we have corruption, we have misleading information, we have hidden information. If I'm free, it's okay. I can live with this kind of free market where we are equal. But where we are equal, we are not equal. I don't own a bank. I'm not a billionaire, so we are not equal. So yeah, I believe that maybe they have some sort of good ideas in their books, but ultimately,
I even find their critiques of the state misplaced, because they're not having a go at the state for the way it's. Well, first of all, I'm never quite clear what they mean by the state. It's a kind of movable feast. So for anything they don't like is the state. So the private enforcement of property rights, that is not the state. Private death squads, you're a multi-billionaire in your, proprietarian, my preferred term, or private statist is another term for them, but what they like to call themselves libertarian. You can have your death squads, you can have your prisons, you can have your police, you can have your army, you can have torture, as long as it's run privately and that you can demonstrate to yourself that the victim has violated your property rights. You can do pretty much whatever you like. In what sense is that not the state? So I'm not even clear on what they consider to be non-state, what they consider to constitute consent, because it seems you can do whatever you like to your children because they're not able to consent. They are your property until 18, and yet even a 3-year-old is able to offer opinions, and therefore you can do whatever you like to animals. So their whole system of critique, I find deeply, deeply problematic from pretty much the baseline. And so even the superficial stuff of, well, we don't like authoritarianism. Well, which rational person doesn't? And yet you find them proprietarians celebrating Pinochet and, the South African government or Trump.
Yeah, absolutely correct. Yeah. They supported the overthrow of Salvador Allende, and the Chicago boys, I believe, the Chicago School of Economics, and they were involved in many tragic, So let's move to my next question. Let's talk about the postmodernism or post-anarchism that you in the reader Post-Anarchism. You identified three types of post-anarchism. First, the libertarian post-anarchism, second, redemptive, and then finally a postmodern anarchism. So let us explain, because in my opinion, I see post-structuralism, because I love Foucault. Foucault is, for me, one of the greatest philosophers of all time, maybe. And he was inspired actually by Max Stirner, who is an anarchist, and also by Friedrich Nietzsche, which I believe he was also an anarchist, but it's up for debate. Yeah, let's discuss this term post-anarchism and the three types that you described in the article.
Oh, well, thank you for that. You recalled something I wrote, must have been about 15 years ago. So let me see if I can remember the three different types. Actually, I might have to quickly have a look myself. So, but you're right. I was aware that just as you know, postmodernism has multiple interpretations. So does post-anarchism. So I think one interpretation, and again, I've been better prepared for this, was simply a sort of anarchism situated in the period of post-modernity. So you're dealing with the issues which arose out of post-modernity, the rise of mass media, the internet, genetic modification. These are issues, new issues, which anarchists are having to respond to in the period of post-modernity. I guess then the second type of post-anarchism was one which had a core of anarchist ideas, but recognized there were some elements which were missing or weak, and that you could improve upon it by bringing in some of the analyses from post-structural thought. You're going to have to correct me if I've got my own account wrong here, Joseph. I think the third one was a sort of an overarching post-anarchism, much less modest post-anarchism, which largely said anarchism has been and gone. It's, very ontological, epistemological, and valuative basis no longer applies, and that a new form of anarchism based on a kind of more Leotardian principles and outlooks was required. Have I got that? Have I got you right?
And there is also this critique from Saul Newman, or what was his name? Newman. I remember Newman correctly, and he's also a proponent of this post-anarchist thinking. And I believe his critique was that the classical, the canonical writings of anarchism, such as Bakunin, or especially Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, they had some, sexism in their writings, and also they were anti-Semitic. Yeah, it's true, and also, yeah, and what now? So should we stop reading them, or what is the conclusion? And so it's a hard question. And
I should first of all, I mean, there's no doubt about Proudhon's sexism. You don't have to go too far. Oddly, even though he said some really repellent things in his private notebooks about Jews, and they're completely inexcusable, in his published works, there is, for a French writer of his period, surprisingly little, which is, and I don't want to excuse him, surprisingly little, which is, no, it shouldn't be any, of course, but surprisingly little for a person of their period. But you're right, there are elements in all writers which we can find unsatisfactory, and no doubt a careful reader will unfortunately find elements of prejudice and bigotry even in my text. I try my best not to be, but I live in a culture where gendered terminology, Occidental references prevail. I'm writing, for an audience who's going to judge me on the basis of whether they get the references. So I'm going to repeat certain unintentional biases and bigotries of my own writing. So I am not going to claim some position of purity for myself. And I think it's right that when we engage with writers, we're aware of their weaknesses and limitations as well as what they've got to offer. We don't stop reading Heidegger because of his associations with Locke. We don't stop reading, Locke because he was, seemed to be a supporter of some quite extreme forms of imperialism and colonialism. And
slave trading,
slave trading. And nor should we. We should be aware of how his texts were used. And on the plus side, I believe he was involved in a regicidal plot. So there's good and bad in everyone. But we should be aware of them when we engage with them, and still see what we can gain from them. So the fact that certain classical anarchists had some very significant bigotries and prejudices, I think the post-anarchists are right to raise that as an issue and to highlight how that might be informing the ways that we've interpreted them to try and avoid that. That is a perfectly legitimate thing to do. The idea that we should reject the text out of hand becomes far more questionable. And I wouldn't even say that for people like Heidegger or Hayek, for instance. I would still engage with Hayek's writing, even though he had some extremely dubious, authoritarian, racist, homophobic connections, as did von Mises. Von Mises, is deeply homophobic in his text. I don't see people say, business schools dropping him from the curriculum.
Yeah.
So so there are certain things I think the post-anarchists get right. There are elements of truth to their critique. What I find questionable is that they make, I think, certain peripheral features core. So they say that anarchism has, it's often based on a kind of Leninist reading of both of Marx and anarchism, which they are reiterating. Actually, as it were, taking a reading of anarchism, which itself is a product of the Cold War and isn't one that the anarchists hold. So they claim anarchism is essentialist, it has this benign essentialism, which anarchism doesn't have, and they make that at the foreground. They say that anarchism has a single domain of power, either the state, in which the economy is merely an outcome of statism, or alternatively, a critique of the economy in which the state is merely an epiphenomena of a particular type of economy. But anarchists tend to have a much more divergent view and diverse view of the way that power operates, and did so well before postmodernism and post-structuralism. You alluded to the fact that Foucault was interested by and influenced by people like Stirner and certain features of the broader anarchist tradition, and that's not really a surprise. The whole of many of the post-structuralist thinkers were members of libertarian socialist movements, and used elements of libertarian socialism, disconnected it from a socialist politics in some instances. Some didn't. Some still paid at least lip service to wider social liberation, and I think Foucault is one of those. But people like Baudrillard, I think members of the libertarian socialist movements around 68, others were highly influenced by them. So it's no surprise that they are repeating these features, but these are the features they got from anarchism. So post-anarchism are actually saying, look, we're taking this account of power from the post-structuralists. Where did the post-structuralists get it? From the heterodox Marxists and the anarchists. So they're kind of misrepresenting anarchism. But it has a single political strategy as a result. And one of the main features of anarchism has been its diversity of tactics and its necessary diversity of organization. So I think there's kind of a straw man building in post-anarchism. And that's not to say that certain anarchist groups did have some of these features. No, if you want to galvanize people into action, no, it's easy to say, in a sort of a rhetoric, no, history is on our side. But how deep is that within their practice and policy? How much are they actually committed to an ontology of determinism? I would argue pretty limited, because if they were truly determinist, there'd be no point acting. History will do it for you. So I think that post-anarchism has perhaps created a bit of a straw man. I think some of its, I think post-anarchism is useful and I don't dismiss post-anarchism. I'm not someone who says, oh, post-anarchism has nothing to say, or it's just too convoluted, or it's a complete straw man, because there were anarchist groups which did have those elements. And I think post-anarchism did offer a challenge and made us go back to what the text was saying. So it was a useful provocation. I think anarchists were doing that as well. I don't think you needed it for post-anarchism, but post-anarchism offered it. And it also opened up, again, I think anarchism was already doing it, but it was another avenue for doing so, opening up other canons to look at, to the canons of anti-colonial and post-colonial theory, the canons of feminism, and of course the canons of post-structuralism itself. And I think it had certainly in its earlier iterations of people like the earlier works by Newman and by Todd May are very much a Leninist reading of Marx.
Yeah,
I think that was unfortunate. But you've got new waves, excuse me, you've got new waves of post-anarchist writers. And indeed, Rancière, as you rightly point out, he's one who's kind of, I'm happy to be called an anarchist and engage with anarchism. So you've got, both, got post-structuralists who are happy to adopt a kind of anarchist label, and, maybe anarchist activists who are perhaps more happy to adopt some of the analyses, rhizomic analysis from Deleuze.
In my opinion, it's clear for me that with changing social structures, of course, the tradition also has to adapt and has to change. So it's logical for me that this kind of post-anarchism evolved, because we are not working in factories anymore, or most of us. And the worker class, the working class, the class struggling class, so to speak, it's how can I say, it changed. Our social structure changed, our mode of production did change. So it's logical that we have other problems, and the class dimension is somewhere behind, or somewhere it's smaller than it should be. That's also one observation of mine, but there are other problems, and the focus is nowadays it's on vogue to speak about intersectional feminism, racism, colonialism, ability, disability, this kind of stuff, ageism, body shaming, and the problems are much more. In my opinion, it's not an because you talked about the ontological level. For me, you mentioned essentialism, and the critique was also that anarchists put one version of utopia out there, but that's not true. Yeah, I agree with that, and that there is a theological progress. Maybe we see it in Marx, and this was his Hegelian thinking, that there is a progress in history. But yeah, I think anarchism is different. Anarchism, in this sense, anarchism is more chaotic. So it's not a direct line, okay, from here and there, and how we get there, and then everybody will be happy. And
it's about, it's what people get confused by is the notion of multiplicity. They seem to think that if you are saying there are multiple forms of organization, multiple forms of oppression, and multiple forms of practice which can challenge that, and different ways of and evolving notions of what the good is, what the goal is, that will, it's constantly changing and transcending as we engage in the struggle for liberation. And there are multiple forms of it, that anything goes.
Yeah.
No, those are, just because you're saying there are more than one doesn't mean that anything and everything is possible. Now, there are more than one way to play football, but you still can't use a bazooka to shoot the opposition.
Yeah, I'm very glad and honored that you mentioned this, because I encounter this on a daily basis. This idea, this neoliberal idea, this postmodern idea of anything goes, and it's a false reading of Judith Butler that gender is like a cloth, and today I'm wearing you know, a woman's dress and I feel like a woman. Tomorrow I'm a man. But Judith Butler never said this, so it's a misinterpretation of her work also. And also in this liberal idea that, okay, this Benetton, this equality, like the Benetton colors, yes, blacks and Turkish people and from Southern Europe, yes, come in if you producing stuff, and if you're working, and if you don't have problems with the state, you can stay here under the premise that you are a productive person, under the premise that you obey to our ideologically theories. Okay, we are fine. So this is equality under the premise of capitalism, and this is the Benetton colors kind of anything goes and equality. So yeah.
Absolutely. Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and this has nothing to do with anarchism, because yeah, maybe it sounds like just, it sound on the third, if you don't if you are not very much involved in politics, and if you didn't have the time to read anarchist books, maybe it sounds like it's everybody's equal, and this liberal ideas if you heard them the first time, maybe they sound just and good, but actually they are not. They are hiding their premise.
And again, you can understand how that sort of rhetoric can be seductive. I don't like being told what to do, but who does? Therefore, I'm allowed to do anything. Well, no, that doesn't follow. So you get this kind of dismissal of norms or morals. You get this from anarchists themselves. It's one of the tropes that really sort of grinds my gears, is this denunciation of moralism. And I'm never quite clear what they mean by it, because in the sense it's already self-contradictory. Because what they're saying is moralism bad, non-moralism good, which is a normative position. So it's already got this sort of seeds of self-contradiction within it. And of course it's inconsistent, because they are themselves always engaged in a set of practices where they've got accounts of what the good and the bad is. Now they're normally trying to write texts or engage in a conversation which is meaningful, trying to be persuasive. So they've got an account of how to deal with one another, which is built into the practice. So there's already an embedded norm in there. And of course, Bakunin, Goldman, Melitasta, and especially Kropotkin all wrote about morality and all used moral values in their approaches. What they all have in common is that there is a transcendent element as well. But whatever the norms are for now, for what we need to achieve now, they are always open to future challenge. And I think that's what they're. So it's not about avoiding normative evaluation. If you're calling yourself an anarchist engaged in a struggle against oppression, you are making a normative statement. Oppression is wrong, and there is something better than it. So you can't avoid making a evaluative judgment, and it can't just be down to kind of subjectivism. And I don't like oppression, because then you can't challenge the oppressor. No, you don't like oppression, the oppressor likes oppression, you'll just have to agree to differ. So it can't be just down to subjectivism. There has to be something which is intersubjective. Doesn't necessarily mean it's universal, but something which is pervasive and necessary for our social actions at that moment and beyond.
It's also very interesting. Maybe this is also a difference between anarchism and post-anarchism. I read interesting book of the anarchist Rainer Schürmann. He's not very famous. Rainer Schürmann wrote a philosophical work on ontological, how to say it. He's an anti-fundamentalist. His thesis is that there is no answer to social problems, and there is no such thing as morality, and no fixation. So maybe I did not understand him well, but in this sense, there is no fundament. There is no ground on which we can build a society. There is no ground on which we can build a state or legitimize a state or society or morality. There is no such thing. And so, yeah, it's an interesting book, and it make me, yeah, it's difficult to understand, but
that nihilism provides just a cloak of cover. So there's no grounds for morality. So you've got no grounds for preventing racism, sexism, capitalist exploitation, environmental degradation. There's no grounds for it. So it completely suits the status quo. Nihilism is essentially conservative. It has all that, and we've all gone through in our adolescence, and perhaps even for me a bit later than that, a kind of nihilist phase, but it is a fundamentally conservative position, because what it's saying is there's nothing therefore to challenge the state. And just because there aren't fixed foundations doesn't mean there aren't core and pervasive values. And indeed, I haven't read Schumann's book. It sounds really interesting, and I'll try and get hold of it. But my guess is he's obeying certain norms in writing the text. He's engaged in he wants to write as clearly for his readership as possible. He's probably claiming property rights over the text, and certainly the publisher will. Is engaged in all sorts of normative actions in order to get that text produced and read.
Yeah.
So the fact there may not be any foundational norms for that text to operate, he has got to ascribe to certain norms and maybe challenge them in places if you want to make them better.
Yeah, yeah. And let's keep it philosophical. Last semester as my hobby, I study philosophy as well, because I love philosophy. I'm not good at it, but I'm trying my best. And reading Aristoteles, it was quite funny. And I have a lot of critiques, of course. Yeah, he didn't criticize slavery and so on and so forth. We know all this stuff. So it's a lot to say about his thinking, but on other points, I couldn't find an argument against him. So no doubt he was a great thinker. And his ethics also inspired Michel Foucault, for example. So it's interesting, yeah. So how can we use ethics in an anarchistic sense? So you talked about virtues, so virtue ethics. So why do we need it, and how we can apply it?
Well, first of all, you've got to recognize that it's not an original point. We are always already engaged in ethics. Now, just through our encounter with others, how we treat them, whether we respond to their questions or ignore them, to acknowledge or deny, is a normative choice. So there isn't a position where ethics doesn't apply. So first of all, and it's to recognize that I do ascribe to a virtue ethics. Where I differ from Aristotle is that I think that the virtues are fundamentally anti-hierarchical, that you flourish best through cooperative anti-hierarchical social relations, and I think I can demonstrate that. I don't think you can be a threat, you're genuinely in a friendship if your person is in a constantly oppressive position to you. I don't think you can constitute the virtue of liberality and fidelity in such a relationship. Similarly, reworking education. What is good education? For me, good education is the co-production and sharing of knowledge. Breaking down the hierarchies. Yeah, I hope, know a bit more about what I'm teaching than the student. But by the end of it, that hierarchy should be lessened. And not only that, I should then have learned something from the students as well. So that relationship of student and lecturer becomes reduced, and the distribution of knowledge, the hierarchies of knowledge are undermined. If you're just interested in storing and maintaining hierarchies of knowledge, I don't think you're involved in good education.
Yeah.
I don't think it's you're not portraying the virtues, you're not generating wisdom as a result. So for me, the virtues are fundamental. You know, if I like Aristotle as well, I like trying to spot where I disagree with Aristotle. There's a point of, you jump from the household practice to the state. Why do you necessarily need the state for household practices to flourish? You know, for instance, might be one area where you could, find a flaw in Aristotle's account. But nevertheless, so for Aristotle, he seems to assume that certain people just can't generate the virtues without any evidence to support that. Indeed, there's kind of contrary evidence to that, even within his texts. But he's not therefore actually allowing the virtues to flourish. You're not actually creating flourishing, prospering individuals, institutions, or societies. And so like I say, I greatly admire Alistair McIntyre. I'm aware that, you know, he's gone through various phases, being a radical, then a conservative, then a radical again, at various junctures. And so there are multiple ways to read his text. But for me, virtues flourish through our social interactions and our social lives. And if we want to make a anti-hierarchical society, one which allows people to flourish their fullest, that means developing the right sorts of social practices, social organizations, social institutions which allow those virtues to flourish best. And capitalism fundamentally undermines. There is a corruption of our institutions.
I can see it in academia, in the academic field, that there is this love, this passion for objectivity. And I can see it in every theory, and even Marxist inspired thinkers always put it in in the box. They are not serious. Why? Because they are in love with some theorists, or because they want to change the world, because they want to make a more just world, or whatever it is. And so because they are fighting for a more just society, because they are in passion with something, because they have a normative premise on normative theory, they are called unserious, not serious. They are, and we have this love for objectivity. So you have to distance yourself from the field of research and so on and so forth. So as an academic, you have to be schizophrenic to.
And there's a kind of dishonesty as well, because every text, even the most dry, hardcore logic paper, dealing with the semantics and syntactics of multivariable, multi-value predicate logic. The person who wrote that was motivated to do that for a reason. They were, they were infused by logic. They liked the clarity which logic operated by, or they were forced into it by a manager. But there will be a motivation behind it. There is no unbiased position. The best we can do is acknowledge our biases so that they're held open and accountable. And someone who is not at this moment motivated by issues of climate emergency, by social and economic injustice, by fears of imperialism and encroaching authoritarianism, is simply being negligent.
Yeah, good point. Yeah. So before I got to my last question, I want to ask you about this methods of prefiguration, direct action, propaganda of the deed. So these are anarchistic methods or anarchistic ethics that are applied. So yeah, maybe for people that are not much into anarchism, so what is prefiguration, what is direct action, what does propaganda of the deed means, and yeah, is it actual today? Can we apply it today, or is it just theory? Or
well, you ask. First of all, I'm a bit worried by your viewers because we've been doing this for an hour and 20 minutes. So my apologies. I'm going to ramble on even longer. Really fascinating and absolutely vital. So there is a very close conceptual link between prefiguration and direct action. Prefiguration is a term of relatively recent vintage, though the concept itself is far older. So prefiguration just means that in its sort of most general form, that your methods embody your goals. And you find this in the very earliest of anarchists. You find it in Bakunin, you find it in Goldman, you find it in James Gilloom. So, Gilloom says, in his famous criticism of, Marxism, status of socialism, how can you bring about an egalitarian, free and equal society through authoritarian means? So it's a prefigurative criticism. Your means have to embody your goals. You should try and bring about an egalitarian, free society through methods which are as egalitarian and free as possible. And Emma Goldman, when she was looking at the Leninist Russian Revolution, says that all human experiences teaches that methods and means cannot be separated from the ultimate aim. The means employed become through individual habit and social practice part and parcel of the final purpose. And we find this notion obviously in Marxism itself, through Hegel, through the dialectic of the master and slave, that if you have someone mediate between you and your goal, the thing which is mediating becomes dominant. So you may think that you are acting instrumentally, but actually what you think is the goal is actually the mediating term. So a good example is the people who think that I want an egalitarian society, but we'll use a police state to get there. Okay, my goal is an egalitarian society. What's the quickest and easiest way to do it? Well, we'll get a police state who will enforce egalitarianism. And once everyone's got used to egalitarianism, then the police state can start to disappear. And therefore, you have to do everything possible to build the police state, because that is now your means to get to that end. And so what becomes more and more important is the police state, and anything which challenges that police state becomes the enemy. So in the end, all you're doing is supporting it. So prefiguration gets around that. Your methods and goals have to be in concordance. Now, some people talk about prefigurative politics as a sort of synonym for anarchism, and it may be a necessary one. I think we started off by discussing how difficult it is to get funding in anarchism, and using in your funding applications synonyms which avoid the A word, or apparent synonyms which avoid the A word, do give you more success. I'm not criticizing people for doing this. I've seen people pursuing alternative forms of governance as a sort of synonym for anarchism, and good luck. If it works, it works. We have to sell our labor to survive. That is the nature of the capitalist economy. And if your work requires you to raise grant funds from what may be hostile institutions, putting a gloss on it, which is not frightening to them, but it's still an accurate representation of what you do, that may be legitimate. So you sometimes see people refer to prefigurative politics as a synonym for anarchism. But there are a couple of provisos to bear in mind, that anarchists aren't the only one who try to prefigure their methods in their goals. Fascists can do it, liberals can do it, authoritarians can prefigure their methods in their goals. And I argue that capitalism, part of capitalism's success is that capitalism prefigures its ultimate goal of maximizing exchange value through its method of trying to extract as much exchange value as possible. So prefiguration itself is not sufficient for anarchism, but it's pretty core to it. So you also need anti-capitalist values, anti-hierarchical values, a recognition of other forms of domination which we need to deal with to make a genuinely anarchist practice. But prefiguration is core, but isn't by no means.
Yeah. So in that sense, because the channel is, a Peace Institute, and also I'm involved in peace studies, and it's fascinating to read about anarchism, but anarchism is like a double-edged sword, because on one hand you have this violent history. You wrote about the Lancaster bomber, an anarchist who killed this anarchist who killed the Russian Tsar, and so on and so forth. So you have a lot of violent the class war is actually a war. You have this violent crimes, or maybe it's not a crime, but it's up for discussion. And then on the other hand, you have this pacifism, this sort of non-violent class struggle. So yeah, how we can combine them, or maybe John Holloway was right that we have to, accept our differences and to break capitalism in different ways, each from his perspective and with his methods.
I mean, as you know, there are people who call themselves anarcho-pacifists, and some of my friends and colleagues identify themselves very much with that tradition. I don't, not because I'm against peace, but there is no peace. And I'm not quite certain what they mean by peace, because there's always going to be some form of conflict. What is often called peace is merely, if you talk about capitalist peace, is put up with your exploitation, put up with the fact that your lives are going to be degraded by industrial illness, lack of access to resource, lack of opportunity to flourish, heavy policing. Put up with those, because that's peace. Being put up with the fact that the environment is being degraded and your kids better evolve skills or they're going to suffer. That's peace. Putting up with that is peace. Now, clearly, I know that lots of pacifists don't see that as peace. They have a different account. So for me, the question is not one of peace per se. I think we live in forms of coercion and manipulation, which are just built into our social activities. So the question is, which are the least manipulative, which are the least coercive, which maximize the equalization of power relations most efficiently? You're aware of, the challenge to Tolstoy that, there's a gunman about to blow up a school. You could knock him out if you throw him a half brick, but if you don't throw the half brick, he's going to blow up the school. If you're an absolutely committed pacifist, is throwing the half brick to save the school and all the school children blowing up violent or not? And I would argue it's rather, I would commit that small act of violence, minimal act of violence, to prevent a greater. In which case, I can't call myself a pacifist.
I understand you.
Yeah.
It's a good point. Yeah, it's a good point. Yeah.
Make it so. And given that we live in a society in which there is embedded violence already, what is the minimally least violent way of equalizing power relations? Yeah. Because I know as a person with a checkered political reputation, Pastor Reinhold Niebuhr. Now he says, of the pacifists, they're right. He's a great admirer of Gandhi. He was a supporter of Martin Luther King, but they're not pacifists. You are deliberately undermining, causing economic hardship, deliberately. No, you're undermining the well-being and access to resources of the British worker, of the capitalist, of the imperialist, of the racist. You're deliberately upsetting, causing psychological and physical harm to them. And you're doing that deliberately. In what sense is that pacifist? It's not saying they're wrong, on the contrary, it's saying they're the right thing to do. What it's questioning is whether or not it's actually pacifist.
Yeah.
And if it's not pacifist, what is it then? And I would argue it's right sort of actions. It's just not pacifism. It's using the least hierarchical forms of violence appropriate to those. And that's what we should be borrowing from the pacifist tradition. But I would question, because there are certain circumstances that actually having to use something which is overtly coercively violent is actually the least violent thing you can do under those circumstances. And actually not to do it is to perpetuate and allow a greater set of violent practices to develop. So I can't call myself a pacifist, though I am clearly influenced by the pacifist traditions and the people who call themselves anarcho-pacifists. I would argue in certain circumstances, actually not doing the least violent thing, and in other circumstances, what they're doing is just a form of violence, but legitimate.
Yeah, it's a tough question because you cannot look at the crime and go away, so it's not easy. So yeah, I understand. On the other hand, you have to make in an anarchistic society, you cannot be paternalistic. You have to let them make their own decision, their free decision. And if it's his decision to make a crime, to abuse somebody, to kill somebody, it's his decision, it's not yours. And maybe it's all, yeah, it's a difficult question. On the other hand, we are in a class struggle. So if I'm blind and if I do nothing, the class struggle, the oppression and the hierarchy will continue. So I have to rise up, and I have to, yeah, to work against it. And how we can work against it, maybe with violent tactics. Yeah, I understand. So maybe it's long-term and short-term. In my utopia, so to speak, and in my anarchistic, free egalitarian society, maybe there is a less need of violence, you know, and also.
Oh, absolutely. As a goal, you know, as a goal for your society, an ideal society should not have the permanent threat of nuclear annihilation. And it's one of the bizarre, you know, features of so-called minimal statists, that they they want to get rid of the welfare state, access to welfare, no, because you can't trust the government to do these things. But they do trust the government, the same incompetence, the same corrupt individuals, the same selfish, malevolent individuals who run the state. And I have no problem with, you know, that is almost invariably the case. But they're perfectly happy for them to have access to nuclear weapons and an army. That's the last thing they look to get rid of. So no, we should not, and no ideal society should have an existential threat hanging over. No society should have the threat of, you know, brutalizing police operating within their system. No one should have the threat of going hungry or thirsty or homeless, or having their environment so degraded that their ability to live and plan for the future is fundamentally undermined. Now, that is not in any shape or form an ideal society, and it's clearly, you know, one which anarchists share, that, you know, we want to avoid those and have different types of social institutions, allow for flourishing ecosystems, benevolent social relationships, and we should try and embody those as far as possible in the types of organization we have. But in embodying them, there sometimes is the challenge to those doing the violent act, the criminal act. I would disagree. I think, you know, there were times when it is legitimate for an anarchist to stop someone doing a particularly heinous type of crime, not shoplifting. Obviously, people, if you know, lack access to resource, of course you should turn a blind eye, or even, you know, assist through various means the shoplifter. I'm sure we've all been in positions where that has been required. But that doesn't mean, you know, we help the house burglar who, you know, victimizes a working class elderly person. Now, we're aware of differences in power and power relations.
Yeah. Also taking this Marxist thinking, this Leninist thinking, maybe Stalinist thinking. First, we take the power of the state, and then we make a just society, then we make anarchism. So this is also a false thinking of violence and anarchism and free society.
That's
so
right.
yeah.
So because I think instrumentalism, that Stalinist, Leninist instrumentalism, which justified a particular forms of instrumentalist violence, actually rejected other types. So they were fundamentally against things like workers' sabotage, and even considered strike actions as a pretty low-level form of political contestation. Real politics is building the party state, not through industrial activism, building your own communities, building your own organizations. That was pretty low level. So actually, they were against certain forms of violence because they were after much more instrumental forms of violence. And because that was associated with socialism, so you can understand why, the anarchist tradition, which is based on prefiguration, so we don't want any part of that. So it's, we'll address ourselves in terms of pacifism. That's a fully understandable move in a period where violence is associated with state. But there are different forms of violence. I think there are anti-hierarchical forms of violence, minimal violence, the most minimal, which is better than, on occasions, the violence of omission.
I believe that all anarchists have in common that they are against structural and state violence. On the individual levels, for example, I believed and I thought that I was a pacifist, but then I got in a troublesome situation. And it was in Bulgaria. I was recently, 1 week ago, I was in Bulgaria. I stayed for 1 week in a hostel, and there 2 drunken guys showed up, wanted to rape a girl, and it was a absurd situation, and a German guy stood up and shouted, you cannot do this and stop doing this. And then I couldn't help myself, and I got also up, and yeah, we almost got in a fight. So in this sense, it was in my heart. It was automatically, I did it without thinking, oh, wait a minute, what are my philosophical theories? And no, I did what I felt right at this time. And these drunken guys had to be, yeah, I had to put an end on this situation, on this ugly situation. And also I met some, how can I, without without being rude to these people. So some people dream of utopia where there is always peace and we are dancing, smoking weed, and and
sorry, Joseph, you cut out just for a moment. I think my internet is becoming unstable, so my apologies if I stop pixelating. I missed what you said. Some people dream of a utopia, and then you cut out for me.
Yeah, I don't want to be rude and against these people, but there are some dreaming. There are people dreaming of a egalitarian, peaceful society where everybody's smoking weed and dancing around and this hippie stuff and so on. And they are also saying that they are anarchists, but this is also it's hard to criticize them. I understand their belief system, but you have to change some things. You have to it is a struggle. So I understand both sides. I understand the violent side. I understand the peaceful pacifist side. But then as I'm reading, I started with a theological study, and Jesus Christ also rise up against the in the synagogue. You are dealing with money in my school.
That kicks over tables and.
So he was also not peaceful and not a pacifist. So
I know, and yet there is the Christian anarchist pacifist tradition. My good colleague Alex has written a number of texts exploring this. And again, intrigued by what he has to say. I don't necessarily agree with all of it, and it certainly doesn't hit all the buttons for me. But there is something through those critiques. I think what the pacifists can do is add to our an appropriate term, but pacifists can add to our armory. They can add to our repertoire of tactics. So that rather than there's some instances that all you can think of, like the one you came up to, where somebody was going to commit a gross act of violation, of violent violation on another person. But the only appropriate response at that moment was to resist. There were other times when you think that's the enough, and I completely agree that was the right thing to do in those terms. There were it was hard to think of what another one could be. But there may be other instances where I think that's the only response. But actually, I can think, thanks to learning from the pacifists, I can think of maybe another strategy which might be even more effective at those moments. So it's not a tradition I have huge sympathy for, but I can still learn from.
Yeah. Dear Benjamin, I have no further question. It was a great pleasure talking to you. It was a great pleasure meeting you. I loved your books and articles, and I learned a lot from them. And yeah, it was really a great pleasure having a philosophical talk with you.
Joseph, the pleasure's been all mine to revisit my texts with someone who is so enthusiastic. It was a genuine pleasure. And if any of your viewers of this want to get in touch with me afterwards, then I'm easy to Google Benjamin Franks at Glasgow or get my university homepage, but they can contact me on my work email, benjamin.franks@glasgow.ac.uk, and I'll be happy to answer any further questions. So thank you so much for engaging with my work in such a thoughtful way and supportive way. It means a huge amount to me.
It's nice to hear that, yeah.